Hello, and welcome to the Flying Focus Video Bus. My name is Dan Handelman. I'm with Flying Focus Video Collective and Portland Copwatch, and we're going to be talking about some information that Copwatch has been compiling over the years tonight. And I'm joined by Jasmin, who's a reporter from KBOO Radio, and she's going to help walk through some of this stuff. And do you want to tell people a little bit about some of the work you've done on police issues over the years?
Yeah, so I have been a KBOO reporter since about 2017, and along with my reporting partner, Sam Bowman, who you've seen on the show before, we have been covering specifically police accountability issues with a big focus on how city resources and community resources participate in holding police accountable. So that might mean CRC meetings or city council sessions or training advisory council, anything like that.
Thank you very much for helping tonight. So one of the things I want to talk about is police misconduct cases that led to settlements. We at Portland Copwatch put out a news release in the middle of August that talks about the top 25 settlements that have happened since 1993, which when Portland Copwatch started as a group. And it kind of gives overall figures and talks about some individual cases. Are there any of the names that jump on that list that jump out at you, having looked at police accountability stuff over the years?
As far as cases that are on this new list that you put out of top 25 settlements that caught my eye, there are a few that are new in terms of they were settled in 2020 or 2021. And some of the big names on that list are names that will be familiar to the community, specifically the family of Quanice Moose Hayes lawsuit and the family of Terrell Johnson lawsuit. Both of those went through long processes of the community sort of working towards accountability in those cases, and there was ultimately no criminal or administrative accountability for the officers involved, but we now have these big settlements.
One of the things that was interesting about both of those cases, they went to city council in 2021. And in each case, the family's attorney was invited by the city council to speak at the city council hearing, which has not happened before. In fact, the city council is kind of deathly afraid of having people talk at these hearings because they're afraid that somehow it's going to affect the ability to follow through on the settlement. So the family of Quanice Hayes and their attorney spoke, and they got like a $2.1 million settlement earlier this year. I think it was in March. And then a couple of months later, the family of Terrell Johnson received a $600,000 settlement. And, no amount of money, they each said, could bring back their loved one. And the sad thing is, and this is the biggest caveat, that when we talk to people in the community who say, oh, well, it's good that the family's gotten some compensation for what the city did to them, that just because they settle a lawsuit doesn't mean anything is ever going to happen to the police officers involved. It doesn't implicate them for committing misconduct or criminal activities, and the system is kind of set up that way, where the city's lawsuit doesn't affect the officer at all. There's actually, in Minneapolis, they tried to put a ballot measure together to insure individual officers so that these kind of payments would come out of their insurance, and then eventually, if they had too many of them, they couldn't be insured anymore, they couldn't be officers anymore, which is a great idea, but it got stopped because of technicalities.
It does get to the heart of that matter, which is that if the civil suits are intended to represent a sort of consequence, like a version of justice, in that both the person who was wronged or the family of the person who was wronged get some support, and the entity that wronged them has some punishment, some financial punishment, then that doesn't really, there's a real barrier there in terms of that it going from the police department down to it ultimately ends up being Portlanders who pay for these things.
Right. That's correct. And even worse, it's like the city's self-insurance fund. So it's not coming out of the police bureau's budget. It's coming from like this other pot of money. And so the police get to keep this giant budget that I keep complaining isn't large enough, and having the city pay out this extra money. So ultimately, like I said, we've only been tracking this since 1993. Portland Copwatch started as a group the previous year. And the total amount of money, when you add it all up, the average per year now, with the data that we have, and I want to talk more about that in a second, with the data that we have, the average is about $675,000 a year, which is a lot of money for you and me, but for the city, it's like a pittance. The police bureau has more than a $200 million a year budget, and the data, most of the data that we have comes from city council hearings, where they put something on the agenda, and we can look at that and download the paperwork and print it out and find out what's going on and go and testify at city council. There's a whole bunch of them, including over 150 new cases that we just got from somebody who did a public record request, that are never seen before city council because they're for less than $5,000, and because that's the threshold of when city council has to approve in a settlement. So there are all sorts of little tiny ones that I want to talk about a little bit in more detail later on, but it all adds up. And then there was also stuff that we didn't include in the general pot of money, which is the cost of lawsuits because police cars crashed into civilians' cars, and it wasn't what you and I would normally think of as misconduct. It's not like the police officer deliberately crashed into the person's car or violated the rules per se. I mean, it is possible they violated the rules. There's some officers who've been disciplined for their driving records, but very, very rarely. So those monies go out too. And there's also some cases where it's basically something we call negligence. In one case, police did not arrest somebody, and then they went out and caused damage in the community, and so this family sued for the future damages, and that ended up being, I think it was about a $4 million settlement, which is larger than any of the misconduct cases. But I think it's a very different kind of misconduct than actively violating people's civil rights by beating them up or killing them, or some of the other things that are in the top 25 of the list, or some of these other cases where what they did was, and I'll give you an example of something we saw happening over and over again, was lay down spike strips to try to stop a suspect from traveling that they're chasing, and they stopped the wrong car and damaged the person's tires. And I think that, that's, it's a form of negligence, but I think it's misconduct in the sense that they aren't targeting only the person that they're trying to apprehend. That's inappropriate.
Just reading through the numbers, and granted, it's over a long period of time, so it's not necessarily happening every day, but you get this sense, reading through the numbers and the brief descriptions of the property damage and other things that happened, you really get the sense of just a group of people just sort of rampaging through private property, breaking fences, just destroying things, breaking cars, breaking windows in cars. And it's just, I think it's really interesting to see sort of the scope and scale of that, because it's something that a lot of people experience when they live in heavily policed communities, but it can be hard to quantify. And if you think, I mean, the money picture represents something, but also just to think about what it feels like to have a cop break down your fence, kick through your fence because they're looking for somebody else, throw a spike strip out, leave your phone on top of a car, break your phone, break your fence, break into your door, do all these things. And it's just, the emotional and the mental toll of living in a place where those things are possible is pretty significant.
Unfortunately, most of these data are anonymous. It's just we had to put John Doe and Jane Doe in. The ones that come before city council, we know the people's names. We don't always know their ethnic background or what kind of part of the city they live in necessarily. Sometimes you do, and especially, the shooting victims we do know. I did notice that out of the top 25 settlements, 11 of the people or families who received those payments, their loved one was killed by the police. The top 3 are William Monroe, Quanice Hayes, and James Chasse Jr. So William Monroe was a person who has mental health problems, and he was near a park, and people didn't like that he was there. So the police saw him. They claimed he had a knife or something in his hand, and they shot at him with a less lethal shotgun, but the officer had loaded it with live shotgun shells and permanently disabled Mr. Monroe. The officer was actually indicted. So this is the only case of all these ones on this list where the officer was indicted for what happened. His name was Dane Reister, and he took his own life before he could be prosecuted, which, it's very, we don't cheer when officers get hurt because everybody's a human being and nobody should get hurt. But it's very interesting that so few officers ever have been indicted for on-duty use of force. We have 2 now that are related to what happened in protests last year. One was an officer who hit somebody with their car that had supposedly stolen something from a store, and the other was an officer who hit a woman on the head with a baton earlier this year, and that case was settled for $50,000 plus lawyers' fees. And a lot of these figures that we have, some of them include lawyers' fees and some of them don't. So sometimes the city actually paid out more money than what you're seeing on the screen. So then the second highest amount that we had listed there was Quanice Hayes. He mentioned people call him Moose. He was allegedly going around in a neighborhood and threatening people in their cars, and the police chased him to a neighborhood, and they asked him to come out from this garage area, and he crawled out on his hands and knees, and they asked him to get up, and when he got up, he adjusted his pants because they were probably falling down. They thought he was going for a weapon, and they shot and killed him. Shot him in the head and the chest. And the city attorney initially blamed Quanice Hayes' mother for being a mad mother. Quanice's grandmother, Donna Hayes, has been a very vibrant force in the community, a voice for people who have been harmed by the police. And his great-grandmother also joins her at a lot of protest actions. And prior to the settlement, where they talked to city council about what the loss of Moose meant to their family, members of the family had a special session in front of city council to talk about what happened, and that had never happened before either. That was in May of the year he was killed, in 2017, the year he was killed in February of that year. And then the third one, James Chasse, I'm hoping that everybody in Portland knows that name. There's a whole movie about it called Alien Boy. James Chasse also was living with mental illness. He lived in a building downtown. The police saw him somewhere in northwest Portland, and they thought that he was urinating in public. It's never been proven that that's what happened. They chased after him, and he had a deathly fear of police. They chased after him, jumped on him, actually put their full body weight on him, used a taser on him, and broke almost all of his ribs. They brought him to the jail, where the jail nurse said, "You got to get this guy to the hospital," and then on the way to the hospital, he died. And that family has also been, they've not been as active out vocal, but they've really been people who care about police accountability and have helped make some of the changes that have happened over the years. In fact, James Chasse's death led to a weird shift in the bureaus, in the city's policies around police, where they had only trained specific volunteer officers on crisis intervention training. I'll talk about the history of that later. But we had said for years, why don't you give everybody crisis intervention training so that they don't come up upon somebody with mental health problems and harm them? And they said, oh, it's too expensive. We can't do that. But then after James Chasse was killed, they said, oh, we're going to give everybody 40 hours of this training. Now that really hasn't led to all the results we've hoped for, because a lot of the people who still get shot at or killed by the police are in mental health crisis. But I think it's better that as they all have the training, that they don't.
I mean, I think from an accountability perspective, it can be really frustrating that what the police seem to learn from incidents like this is that they need different or better weapons, or that they need different or better training, which, as you said, it's better that they're getting the training than not. But it's hard to say that we're seeing real on the ground results from that training, which is just without a really extensive data set, it would just be really hard to tell. There have been outside agencies tasked with sort of evaluating deadly force incidents. And those agencies, it used to be, I forget who the first agency was, but for the last decade or so, it's been the OIR group. And they do this detailed analysis, they present it to city council, they make these reports. And for cases where police have consistently said, there's nothing we could have done differently. We were forced into this situation. The victim forced us to kill them. They say this again and again. The OIR group or these outside agencies are able to find opportunities for improvement of procedure or training, or cases in which standing procedures were violated, standing directives were violated. I'm specifically thinking of Terrell Johnson, who was pursued on foot, but alone by an officer in violation of procedure. And then that officer lost his footing and felt like his only option was to shoot Terrell Johnson, who I believe had been seen with a box cutter and was in mental health crisis, but had not attacked anyone. So I think it does kind of just get back to what you were saying earlier, which is that these lawsuits are a very imperfect version of justice. A very imperfect version of accountability. They don't do a great job at getting to the heart of the problem, and they don't do a great job at forcing the change that the community is asking for, even if the community does feel some bit of vindication for, at least in a civil setting, having somebody admit that something was done wrong, The
next three on the list are Aaron Campbell, whose name you mentioned, Lane Martin, and was a number of protesters, from basically anti-war protesters against the Iraq War in late 2002 and early 2003. Aaron Campbell was feeling suicidal. His brother had died in the hospital, and somebody from the family called the police. And this is just before the Scanner, our local black newspaper, put out an editorial that said, if your loved one is in a mental health crisis, don't call the police. So the police showed up. They had one team that was negotiating with him to get out of the house, and another team that was ready to take him into custody, and they weren't talking to each other. So the negotiation team got him to come out of the house. He put his hands up behind his head, but they wanted to put his hands in the air. So in order to force him to put his hands in the air, one officer shot a less lethal round right in his back, and he reached for the part that got hurt, and they thought he was going for a weapon, which he didn't have a weapon on him at the time. And a sniper shot and killed him. And he was a young African-American man, as was Quanice Hayes, if we didn't say that specifically before. The shooting caused a huge outcry. Jesse Jackson came to town to call out the Portland police for this case, and it led to eventually, directly or indirectly, the Department of Justice coming in to investigate the Portland Police Bureau for patterns and practice of use of force. Now, we have not talked about previous cases that happened that aren't even on this list, where black people were killed by the police, were unarmed, such as Kendra James, who was a young African-American woman shot in 2003, or in the following years, just a few months after Aaron Campbell was killed, a young man named Keaton Otis was also killed by the Portland police, but his family never won a settlement. But there is a pattern and practice of police shooting black people inappropriately in this city. But the DOJ and the city compiles data all the on an ongoing basis of traffic stops, pedestrian stops, and use of force. And all of those data show, this is the police bureau's own data, that there's disproportionate use of force against black people in the city. It's a 6% black city, and 25 to 30% of the force and 25 to 30% of the people shot by the police are black. That traffic and pedestrian stops are about 18 to 20% black in the city. And it's even worse for what's formerly known as the gang enforcement team, where there was more than 50% of their stops. But the DOJ said, oh, well, we can't find anything that was deliberate, that was like racially profiling. And the OIR group that you talked about before, when they reviewed the case of Keaton Otis, which again is not on the settlements list, looked at the fact that they saw this guy wearing a hoodie in his mother's Toyota driving around the Lloyd Center district, and they said, oh, he looks like a gangster. And that's one of the reasons they pulled him over and ended up shooting him. But they didn't see that as racial profiling. And it just, it astounds me. So we have all these experts and, people looking at it, and they don't see the racial element. Now, it is true. I mean, I'm not going to deny what the DOJ found is that there is a pattern and practice of use of force against people in mental health crisis. But sadly, the DOJ came to town, did the investigation, came to a settlement agreement with the city in 2012. More people in mental health crisis have been shot at or killed by the Portland police than in the years prior to that. So again, like you were saying, sometimes we get these remedies that aren't really remedies.
I think to me, I think I would maybe push back a little bit on something that you said about Aaron Campbell, which was that when he reached his hand behind his back, they thought he was reaching for a gun. And I think to me, what I would say is they claimed they thought he was reaching for a gun. And that's the same thing that I would say about what falls apart kind of in terms of trying to prove racial profiling or trying to prove racism. There were early cases in the CRC where people would actually bring concerns about racism to the CRC, and the police were able to say, it wasn't the person's race, it was the fact that he was wearing this specific hat, or it wasn't the person's race, it was the fact that he was doing this. And I think that we know why there can be such a big gap between data, observable fact, and what actually ends up on the official record. And a lot of that difference is that we, as a system, believe what police say when they explain themselves, even if we are seeing something else on a regular basis.
I think that's a very good point in terms of the difference between what the police claim. And part of the problem is the legal standard for you being able to use deadly force is they reasonably believe that the person's going to harm them or, them, the police, or somebody else in the community. And they can just say that. They just get trained to say that. And so they get away with it. The next one is Lane Martin. And this was something that happened in 2019. He's another person in mental health crisis. And he was wandering around a neighborhood with an axe in his hand. And the police kind of cornered him in an apartment building. And by that point, he had dropped the axe because they had shot him with less lethal weapons. And they claim that he pulled a pocket knife out and came toward them, and there's no video. And we can have a long discussion about whether or not we want to have body cameras or not in this community, but the fact is there wasn't any footage of this, so we don't know. They said that he pulled a knife out of his pocket, and they shot and killed him. And that was, a $975,000 settlement. And I was talking to somebody from Portland Copwatch today about how do they come up with these numbers? Like, why was Lane Martin worth $975,000? Why was his life worth $975,000 when Quanice was worth $2.1 million? And it's not really about the worth of their life. It's more about the circumstances where people had seen Lane Martin walking around the neighborhood with this weapon in his hand, and so whenever that happens, the city can just say, well, if you go before a jury, this is not going to look very good, and so sort of that ends up lowering the amount of money that they're going to offer, and sometimes the family attorney will settle for that because of these external factors or whatever objective factors that even though the police did something that took the person's life wrongfully, it raises or lowers these amounts, and it just feels it feels really weird talking about dollars and cents. We're talking about human lives that are lost. And the protesters, so people may or may not know that Portland Copwatch is part of a peace group called Peace and Justice Works, and we were heavily involved in protesting the war, the impending war in Iraq, and then the war in Iraq when it broke out in late 2002 and early 2003. A lot of the protests were sort of kind of like the uprising last year around the death of George Floyd, that they were more decentralized. It wasn't one group said we're having this protest. People just kind of came downtown, and a lot of things went on. And you know, I don't remember all the specifics of the people who got harmed, but I remember one guy was leaning out over the curb with a protest sign in his hands, and the cops threw him to the ground and beat him. And it said there was obstructing traffic, and he was not personally, physically, even in the street. He was hanging off, the sign was hanging off the edge of the curb. That was just one of those outrageous things. And that figure definitely includes the lawyer's fees, the legal fees in that case, and it combined a whole bunch of people together, and that's why it's one of the highest on the list. All right, well, that about wraps it up for this week's part one of our two-part show about police lawsuits and shootings and other misconduct. Thank you very much for joining us, and I want to thank Jasmin for being here, and we'll see you again next week on part two.